INCISION by Lux Noctis. Narrated by Eden. Music by Myuu.
No, I'm not gonna talk about this, came the aggravated whispers in the darkened room. Don't waste your fucking breath. Shadows swayed, guided by light escaping from the cell phone's blindingly bright screen. There was a moment's silence, but the darkness continued to dance excitedly to the rhythm of a half-hearted conversation. You don't get it, do you? I'm done. The room was quiet again as the cell phone protested. Don't bother. You're fucking dead to me. With a short beep, the dance was done. The doctor released a heavy breath in the gloom, unsure of her next move. She fell leadened on the empty bed, one usually reserved for patients, and clutched at a musty pillow. Still not yet cold from its most recent occupant, she pressed it hard to her lips and stifled the most ferocious of screams. Something fell to the ground at her back with a soft click. She placed the pillow down and turned to see a disposable plastic cup twisting idly on the linoleum floor, a small amount of liquid leaking from within. The sensation of being surveyed washed over her, then disappeared just as quickly as it had manifested when the phone began to flash once more. Dr. Williams immediately rejected the call and killed the troublesome device with a swift press of the power button. She stood tall and smoothed down her white coat, the one that demanded so much respect. In preparation, she murmured to herself, counting at a snail's pace from 5 to 1. Then, poise regained, she headed back out into the hospital's stagnant halls. The graveyard shift held a strange dichotomy for the staff at the St. Rose Medical Center. On the one hand, it meant a more manageable workload. Patients are far easier to care for when most of them are in deepest slumber, after all. On the other, those soundless corridors can lead on to an unquiet mind. This is especially true when surrounded on all sides by the sick and the dying. With the concoction of silence and superstition comes paranoia. Could ever there be a more fitting place for restless souls to gather than the location where many of them may have met their end? This bizarre thinking meant that despite the reduced stress and increased pay of the twilight hours, most found them to be disagreeable and avoided them at all costs. Such groundless fears were not an issue for Mrs. Williams, soon to go by a different name, which she'd get her way. She would pay those childish ideas no mind, as a being ruled by logic. Education in her eyes was the cure to ignorance, and eliminating ignorance was key in her field. Every possibility must be analyzed and scrutinized methodically in order to ensure a correct diagnosis. In any case, it seemed to her that all the restless souls in her place of work were still planted firmly within their hosts. She could see the deepest tension in the faces of family members, anxiously awaiting the inevitable passing of a loved one, watching their own flesh and blood fade to black before their eyes. The only ones to find peace at St. Rose were those for whom the curtain had already closed. Not but the living stir within its cold and clinical quarters. Working hard to maintain an air of stoicism, the good doctor made her rounds. It was more a token gesture than anything close to actual work, a thinly veiled attempt to gift the sleepless with some peace of mind. An indication that patients petrified of their various ailments were in the hands of qualified and experienced professionals, rather than having to rest all their hopes on a set of fresh scrubs. She did her utmost to quash the maelstrom of anger and angst that raged within her mind, keeping a steady bedside manner tone as she comforted those wallowing in anxiety. From room to room she stalked, flitting from harsh light into softest shade, footsteps reverberating through vacant space. Finally, she reached room 21, empty for all but one patient. "Good evening," she greeted the elderly attendant, upturning her lips in her finest imitation of a sincere smile. Hello there, Sarah," the frumpy old lady responded. Insisting people address her on a first-name basis was a trust-building tactic. Engaging people on a personal level made them feel less like a statistic. Sarah flashed a quick and, she hoped, unnoticed glance at the chart at the end of the bed to remind herself that the recovering heart attack's name was Layla Jennings. "How are you feeling tonight, Layla?" the doctor asked, observing the 5 empty beds that surrounded them. White sheets all bathed in the ailing yellow glow of an aging bulb. "Oh, I'm feeling much stronger now, taking things one day at a time, you know." She chuckled, but her creased brow betrayed her. "Well, I can assure you, Mrs. Jennings, you have nothing to worry about. Your condition is completely stable. It's normal to feel weak for an extended period following a cardiac episode. The very best thing you can do to aid your recovery is to relax. I promise you, you're in safe hands here. The skeletal doctor flashed pearly teeth at the heavyset patient to punctuate her pre-prepared promises. Of course. The staff here have been incredible, I trust you. It's just difficult not to feel a little fragile at a time like this. The old one gave a short smirk in return for the white coat's toothy performance. It's typical to feel delicate, but there's no need to worry. Let us do the worrying for you. Sarah's delivery was sickeningly sweet. You seem to be going from strength to strength. I think it's safe to say that it's all up from here, Layla. She nodded, giving her own statement a reassuring seal of approval. Mrs. Cardiac Episode seemed satisfied. How are you doing being in this room alone? I hope you're comfortable with the solitude? I'm fine with it. I never really feel alone in this room anyway, if I'm honest. Mrs. Jennings replied heartily, pawing at her blue rinse, revealing a cross-shaped scratch on her inner forearm. What happened to your arm? The doctor asked, bemused. The exhausted senior peered at the mark. I hadn't even noticed that. Oh well, you pick up little cuts and grazes as you go, I suppose. The patient shrugged, her act remaining upbeat. Dr. Williams considered this and then bobbed her head in agreement. Okay, well, you try to get the rest you need, Mrs. Jennings. Remember, if you want anything at all, just hit that call button and someone will be right here to assist you. Of course, I'll do that. Thank you, Sarah. The elderly woman responded sleepily. Good night, Layla, the doctor said as she hit the light switch, ridding the room of that hideous yellow haze. She didn't notice the eyes, the ones aiming a piercing stare at her back from the blackness, as she left Layla Jennings to her fate. No, she didn't spot them, but they were most certainly there, seeing clear as day in the darkness. It was when exchanging hushed words with a cancer patient kept wide awake by chemo-induced sickness that Sarah Williams heard the commotion coming from a short way down the hall. All her efforts to remain near silent were dashed by the frantic cries emanating from her coworkers. She hurriedly excused herself from the conversation and rushed towards the building torrent of sound. A couple of hospital orderlies sprinted past her, carting a stretcher across the slick and shimmering ground. We have to get her to the operating theater now! She's bleeding out! A muffled voice called as the orderlies rounded a corner and barged their way into room 21. A dull thud resounded as the doctor reached the room, the sound of old Mrs. Jennings being loaded onto her only hope of survival. For a moment, Sarah forgot all her troubles. The stress of providing for a child, her piece of shit husband, her lack of satisfaction with life. It all dispersed for a single instant as she watched the sweet old lady glide past her, eyes rolled and convulsing violently, throat open wide. Scarlet poured from her gaping wound, vicious arterial blood collecting on the trundling trolley, framing her face in shades of red. Oh my God. What happened? Dr. Williams asked a shaken-looking nurse who seemed to be turning paler by the second. I don't know. I have no idea. She hit the call button a bunch of times and then I get here and I find her like that. The nurse's hands trembled as she fumbled her speech. Could she have done that to herself? The doctor sighed. She had no idea. It didn't seem like Mrs. Jennings was in the state of mind to take such self-destructive action. During the day, she was surrounded by a supportive family, a loving partner, and she appeared to be in relatively high spirits, even when alone in the dead of night. Certainly a worried patient, but the dithering old lady being suicidal seemed unlikely. The alternative was worse, however, so bleak it almost didn't bear thinking about. The thought that someone in the hospital, be it patient or staff, had wanted to kill a harmless old woman? Worryingly, it seemed to be the logical explanation. Lurking somewhere amongst them was a being cold and cruel, bearing both ill intentions and the malevolent manner to act upon them. You should go to the staff room, stay around other people. Wandering alone might be dangerous, Sarah told the shivering nurse. What? Why? What about you? What are you going to do? The young girl clutched defensively at Sarah's arm as she frantically asked her questions. I'm going down to reception. Something about this just feels wrong. I think we'll all be a lot safer once we get the police here. Do me a favor, please make an effort to keep everybody calm. As always, she tried to maintain her cool and collected demeanor. The nurse took a deep breath and agreed to do her best. Sarah set off, too headstrong to follow her own advice. Solitary, she marched a familiar route. Up ahead, the insufferable buzzing of a halogen light clinging desperately to life could be heard. It grew in intensity as she made her way towards the elevator. She refused to acknowledge the creeping sense of disquiet, refuting its existence before it had the chance to sway her iron will. Standing beneath the bothersome bulb, she hit the elevator call button. The arrow adorning the button sparked into life, glowing a luminous green. Intermittently, her reflection in the closed elevator doors morphed from self-assured medical professional into shaken silhouette. For a second, she could swear she saw another, crouched low to the ground behind her. Dr. Williams' heart skipped uneasily, but when luminescence returned, she was sharing space with no one. Briefly, she entertained the notion that she wasn't so unlike the rest. Maybe she too could feel the groundless pang of superstition. The elevator's mirrored entrance spread slowly, like a carefully opened wound stretched wide after first incision. As she stepped inside, the soles of her sturdy shoes created a tinny clang that reverberated all around her. She hit the switch for the ground floor and stood at the steel box's center, glad to be on the move again. The contents of her stomach shifted as the elevator dropped. It swayed as it moved, and she swayed with it, numb during her brief reprieve from uncertainty. Suddenly the lights went out, and the floor beneath her jerked to a halt. Dr. Williams stumbled blindly backwards, connecting with the smooth walls. She clutched sightlessly at the railing that ran around her perimeter, and a sharp, stabbing pain shot through her wrist. The elevator burst back into action as quickly as it had stopped. Warm liquid ran down the doctor's palm and dripped from between her fingers. At last, reaching her destination, the doors opened. She strode from the elevator, examining the leaking laceration, its finer details hidden beneath thick fluid. That concern was momentary, though, her focus near instantly returning to the task at hand. There was an air of tension in the hospital's reception. The disorder had filtered its way through the ceiling above, and those few below could only sit and wonder what had set in motion the frantic cries and furious footsteps over their heads. The receptionist regarded the doctor with a nervous frown as she approached. "Dr. Williams? What the hell is going on up there?" the lady asked hoarsely. "There's been an incident. I think a patient was attacked in her room," Sarah whispered in return, hoping to avoid causing the inevitable spread of panic that would soon grip the hospital, as word of the elderly lady's unfortunate evening traveled from ear to ear. Jesus, what did they do? Do we know who could have done it? The receptionist's eyes were agape, illustrating equal parts fear and morbid curiosity. No, that's why we need to get the police down here now, before anything else happens and before this turns into a complete shitstorm. This place will go to hell if we don't act immediately. The doctor's words were grave. She could not afford to understate the gravity of the situation. "Sarah." A familiar, smooth voice came from behind, and a burst of hatred and pain surged inside her. "Make the call," Sarah said, leaning over the desk. Then she turned to face her husband, who stood looking downtrodden before her. He scratched his graying hair nervously. "Can we talk?" the sharply dressed man that she used to call her own inquired. "I have nothing to say to you, Darren." Dr. Williams hurled every syllable in his direction, each carrying the force of a well-aimed bullet. She turned on her heels and pushed her way through the heavy, fireproof doors, disappearing down the hall. Sarah didn't know where she was going. All she knew was that she had no desire to speak with her spouse. Darren was the very concept of betrayal, made real and wrapped in an Armani suit. "Sarah, wait, please," the Judas called from behind her, chasing her with hurried strides. "I'm sorry, okay? Really, I am." "You're only sorry you got caught. Get your shit together. I want you gone before I get home," she replied without breaking stride. "Now hold on." Darren grabbed her shoulder in frustration and pulled her forcefully into the nearest room. A shimmering collection of surgical tools and shelves lined with medical supplies surrounded them. "Don't ever lay your hands on me again," the doctor glared. "Look, I just want you to listen to reason. Hear me out, that's all I ask," Darren begged as the lights flickered around them. "You don't deserve my time, and you're not getting a second chance." She stepped back, heading deeper into the supply closet. Her skin crawled whenever he got close. "Now leave. Our daughter is alone in the middle of the night. I know you fail as a husband. For God's sake, don't screw up being a dad." "Come on, Sarah, I need you." The sound no longer came from a man. It emanated from an icon of infidelity. She studied the lines in his face, peered into his dull brown eyes, and saw nothing but a waxwork, an approximation of a human being. She smirked at the figurine. "I don't need you." Sarah bared her teeth. It was a self-assured, carnivorous smile. "What you don't seem to understand is that I never did." And with that, she could have happily eaten him alive. With sorrowful eyes, and to her dismay, her prey began to close the distance between them. Instantly, the world turned black. Her partner's familiar tones resounded in unfamiliar anguish, and before her eyes could adjust to a near-complete absence of light, cold steel ran across the good doctor's legs, creating a gaping hole behind her kneecaps. Tools and medicines spilled to the floor, moved by some unseen force. For a moment, the light returned, and she saw Darren beginning to drag himself towards her, blood pouring profusely from the point where his ligaments had been severed. "Sarah!" he called from beneath the strobing light. Looming behind them was a figure, there in the dark, but gone in a flash. Sarah gritted her teeth against the agony, completely immobilized from the knee down. Darkness came again, and the sound of a scuffle. Her husband was on his back, reaching towards her as she fought to maintain consciousness. Then, the lights died completely. "Sarah," Darren whimpered for a final time, difficult to see through the shadows. "Please forgive me." Bile arose from her gut, and in that instant she forgot the pain as it was replaced so completely by resentment that it became a distant ache. The doctor didn't know what was going on, who had attacked them or why, or if she would live long enough to take her next breath. No, she knew none of that, as the shock began to set in and her limbs seemed to turn into useless, icy tendrils. She did, however, know exactly what to say. "Go to hell." The moment she uttered those words, a nauseating crunch filled the room as a terrifying set of claws closed around her ex-husband's head. The creature was on her then, crouched on her chest, its sharp touch breaking the skin. Sarah grasped the ground, praying that she might find something to defend herself. She wrapped her fingers around a fallen needle and plunged it deep into the monster's back. The tattered tissue that was its mouth spread wide, a malicious grin revealing blackened and broken teeth. A putrid substance oozed from between them and ran down Dr. Williams' cheek. It pinned her arms, trapping her within human strength. Through the gloom, she could see its exposed muscular structure, and she peered into its cold reptilian eyes. A growl of anticipation rumbled in the thing's chest, and it was then that Sarah knew there was no escape. This evil was one with the shadows. She buried her fear deep down, refused to let it show. Sarah Williams will not die weeping, she thought, and in a final act of defense, she spat in the vile being's face. "Do your fucking worst." Grin never waning, it took a scalpel in its charred and twisted hand, and then it began its wicked work.